poems that Coleridge is most famous for, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan, are fantastical verses. They fulfill the goal that Coleridge set for himself in contributing to lyrical ballads in 1798. As he wrote in his Biographia Literaria, Wordsworth, he said, will write about common things, everyday things, but write about these things in such a way that the familiar feels unfamiliar. He will color the familiar with the imagination in such a way as to make the familiar interesting, perhaps strange. Coleridge said he would do the opposite, that he would write about outlandish incidents, strange incidents, supernatural incidents, but with such a psychological accuracy that these strange events actually had a sort of realism, not an empirical realism, but let's say an emotional or psychological realism. He wanted to make the unfamiliar familiar, we might say. So, Rime of the Ancient Mariner did show up in 1798 lyrical ballads. Kubla Khan, though written around the time, was actually not published until much later. Talk about that another time and why that was indeed the case. But Coleridge actually wrote another set of poems, another kind of poem, I should say, before or around the time of lyrical ballads. And this is known as the conversational poem. It's really a kind of poem that Coleridge created. And we see examples of that in this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, Aeolian Harp, Frost at Midnight, The Nightingale. Some might include Dejection and Ode. Some might even include a poem from later on to William Wordsworth. So what is a conversation poem? It seems to be the exact opposite of what we see in Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan. Again, these fantastical poems and heightened, intense lyrical language. The conversational poem is written in a very conversational, almost casual tone. Often Coleridge will begin the poem by going, well, like he might actually do in a real conversation with an interlocutor. Not only that, the poems have very, let's say, common everyday settings. A garden behind his house in Netherstowe, in this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, lying in an outdoor chair, a cot in Clevedon, in Aeolian Harp. So there's an everydayness to these poems, there's a casualness to these poems, and all the poems share the basic structure of a speaker talking to someone else. Sometimes that person is there with him, as in Aeolian Harp. Sometimes that person or those people are not with him, as in this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison. And in another case, Frost at Midnight, the interlocutor is his baby, so the baby can't talk back. But in each case, there is a turn toward an other. And each poem begins in a kind of crisis, some more intense than others. Frost at Midnight, this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison. Both begin with the speaker in a kind of crisis, feeling alone, feeling dejected, feeling alienated, and needing to connect with someone or something. So he'll start talking, and he'll kind of talk his way out of his feelings of loneliness and sadness by imagining connecting with another person. And this, of course, occurs in Frost at Midnight with his saying, look, I'm lonely and I'm sad, and I had a lonely, sad childhood living in London, but I hope you, my dear baby, will not have that you will grow up in the natural world, and all the beautiful things of the natural world shall be sweet to thee. So there's a kind of empathetic turning outward toward his child, and then by the end of the poem, he feels connected to the child and empowered by that connection. We see this in this Lime Tree Bower, My Prison, the same way. He opens up the poem saying, I'm in this bower. It's like a prison. The setting for this poem was that William and Dorothy Wordsworth had visited Coleridge in Netherstowe, and also Coleridge's old school friend, Charles Lamb. And Coleridge and Wordsworth at that time were spending almost every day together, and they're going on these very long hikes together in the Quantocks. And somehow Coleridge's wife Sarah spilled boiled milk on his foot, so he was injured. He couldn't go out for the hike. So it's the classic fear of missing out poem. He's sitting there in the lime tree bower saying, "Oh, it's my prison. I hate it here. I'm alone. I could not go hiking." But then he starts imagining his friends moving across the landscape almost step by step. And the way he imagines them becomes a sort of map of how his own emotional life begins to move. He thinks, okay, now they're going down into darkness. They're going down into a stream, and now they're rising up again. And as he imagines them going down into the darkness and rising up again, he himself emotionally sort of explores his own darkness and rises up again. Until finally, when he imagines his friends standing on the top of a peak looking at a panorama, at that point he says, "Oh, and I was so happy when I imagined what they were doing. I put myself in their position." So again, there's that use of empathetic imagination where he's trying to imagine what it's like to be an other. But he gets there through talking, through this conversation. And when he can imagine what it's like to be an other, he feels less lonely and he feels happy. And this is really powerfully manifested, this desire to unify with another in this lime tree bower, when he imagines Charles again, who himself is from London and who himself had struggled with lots of sorrow. Charles's sister Mary had murdered their mother in a fit of madness, and he was very distraught at this time in his life. And Coleridge says, "Oh, gentle Charles, I know you two have suffered in London. We have suffered together. We are the same in this way. And now here you're having this wonderful experience in nature, and I'm having it vicariously through you." And he looks up from this lime tree bower and he sees a rook, and he says, "And I blessed it, knowing it would fly to you, Charles, and that you would see the same rook that I had blessed." And so the poem ends with his feeling connected to his friends. And the lime tree bower is no prison. He says, wherever nature is, there is no prison. Properly seen, no place in nature is a prison if you are not being overly narcissistic and focusing only on your pain. If you open to the beauties of nature, if you open to the joy of others in nature, then you should have joy. So I just wanted to open our discussion of Coleridge tomorrow by looking at these poems, and we'll pay close attention to the conversational tone in the poems. We'll pay attention to how the speaker, through talking, moves himself out of solitude into some kind of connection. And ultimately, we'll think about the conversation poems as crisis poems, because that's what they are. They all show the poem in some kind of crisis, sometimes seriously, as in Frost at Midnight, sometimes a little less seriously, as in this lime tree bower, sometimes not really seriously at all, as in Aeolian Harp. And we'll think about how the conversational mode is therapeutic in a way, and how it helps Coleridge move through this crisis of solitude and alienation to connect with other people and the natural world.